Hey, this is Dan, one half of your co-hosting duo here on Middleweight Politics. It is early in the morning on Tuesday, and I am about to hit publish on this episode. I'm recording this on my laptop mic, so apologies for any low audio fidelity. Now, as we've always stated, recording a podcast on current events in the Trump age is always challenging. And on Friday, when we recorded this, America had yet to get involved in Israel's war against Iran. But the theme of the podcast remains the same, which is it possible to effectively govern in an era where the partisan base has so much control over what happens? And the one thing I'd ask you to keep an eye out for pertaining to Israel and Iran over the course of this week is whether cracks begin to show in Republican solidarity over Trump's actions. So with that disclaimer out of the way, hope you enjoy this episode. As always, if you do, be sure to leave a comment. We do read them and we do respond. Thanks. Welcome to Middleweight Politics, political analysis for the independent voter, the home of radical centrism, and the place for those of you who like your politics in colors other than red and blue. I am one half of your co-hosting duo, Dan Sally.
I'm Sean Griffiths.
And as always, it has been a busy week. Israel is fighting Iran. Tucker Carlson is fighting Ted Cruz. Stephen Miller is fighting Farm Belt Republicans. And coming in to make peace between these rival factions is Donald Trump. Go figure. The man who has spent his political career throwing metaphorical rocks at metaphorical hornets' nests is wading into unfamiliar territory as he has to somehow find a way to make people less pissed off. Will he succeed? And is this infighting a trap of his own making? We're going to talk about that. But first, as always, blah, 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 like and subscribe, leave a rating. How is that? No, seriously. Both Sean and I have appreciated the growth in this podcast. We feel like we're really seeing signs that there are more people like us who feel like the two-party system is absolute toast, and we really need to build things from the ground up. So thank you for joining us. And if you know other people who need to hear this, be sure to forward it on. I don't know which version you like, Sean. First, second?
Probably the second.
Second one was better. Okay, we're gonna keep both. We'll A/B test that one. Okay. So let's jump in here. Very busy week. First one, of course, is Israel launching airstrikes with Iran. Iran following up with ballistic missiles, and Trump calling for Iran's unconditional surrender. His words, which, I mean, I kind of have to ask how. Because they could stop firing missiles, but there are only so many ways you can not be in the way of Israeli airstrikes, you know?
And it's one of those things where the political pressure, even on Donald Trump, is to remain on the side of Israel here. So if we are not going to strike Iran, which is still up in the air, Donald Trump says, he'll make a decision within the next 2 weeks, which is kind of his go-to.
This one's very interesting because, like you said, there is the pro-Israeli wing of the Republican Party. There's also, let's call it like the residual neocon wing that wants a very aggressive foreign policy. And then there's the isolationist wing.
Yeah.
That doesn't want any involvement at all. And there have been some interesting blow-ups within the GOP as a result of this. I think the most interesting and most shared was the interview that Tucker Carlson did with Ted Cruz, where I don't think I've seen Tucker Carlson that aggressive on anyone in the GOP before.
The thing about the isolationist wing versus the more globalist wing is that I find interesting is that this is allowing some establishment Republicans to kind of get back into being the establishment Republicans they used to be, like Lindsey Graham gets to be the defense hawk that he always used to be. He doesn't have to kind of walk on eggshells right now around a more isolationist tone, which Trump has put out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's interesting kind of coalitions building between parties. So Ro Khanna, liberal, and Thomas Massie, Republican, but probably more of like the Rand Paul libertarian variety, have drafted a war power resolution to limit Trump's ability to get involved without
Yeah.
congressional approval, which I thought was
Hmm.
really interesting.
Yeah, the big headline and the thing that got people's attention was not necessarily Ro Khanna, but the fact that Alexandria Ocasio Cortez got
Mm,
involved in this. When Massey announced the introduction of this War Powers Resolution on X, AOC responded saying signing on.
yeah.
And that got a lot of people's attention because you talk about two people who couldn't be further apart on the political spectrum now coming together and forming this political alliance to prohibit intervention in the conflict between Israel and Iran. And for the Democrats, it could be just to oppose Trump, anything that Trump may do. That could be their end goal. But the fact that you have a progressive Democrat like AOC who's willing to challenge her own party, aligning herself with a libertarian Republican like Thomas Massey, who also is not afraid to challenge his own party, is a
Hmm.
very interesting uh, development this week.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, we don't want to read too much into it, but the Democrats definitely have something to gain by restricting executive power.
Hmm.
And so I generally believe AOC and Ro Khanna are doing this because they don't want to see Trump just unilaterally declare war on Iran. But
Yeah.
there's that element
I
too.
would also like to see that there's just a sincere desire among lawmakers just not to get us involved in another Middle East conflict, not to just thrust us into another Middle East war that will no doubt be prolonged and no doubt drag other countries into it. Because the thing that a lot of people need to understand is that there are other countries who have an interest in what's happening between Israel and Iran. And some of these countries on both sides are waiting to see what the US does, as they always do when it comes to these conflicts. If we get involved, it will pull them into it as well.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know enough about the region or its history to be considered an expert or to be able to offer an expert opinion, but I will say the best counterbalance to Iran's regime was Saddam Hussein,
Mhm.
and taking him out automatically created a power vacuum that expanded Iran's power. And, the other thing I'll say is just what comes after that?
Yeah.
What comes with regime change in Iran, and why and how could we expect that to be any better than our
Mhm.
past experiments in it?
Yeah, I would say that I am by no means an expert on the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East. What I find interesting about this is there are a number of paradoxical things happening here. You mentioned the thing about how Saddam Hussein provided a check on Iran, but also, Donald Trump is talking about how Israel and Iran need to make a deal. And there's all this focus about how Iran might be close to getting a nuclear weapon, which there's no hard evidence to suggest that that is the case because Iran has been weeks away from a nuclear weapon for several years now. But the irony of this is that we did have a deal with Iran that halted the nuclear program that was signed under Obama, and that's the very deal that Trump got us out of.
Yeah, so there's that. Absolutely. To cap off the whole theme of intervening in the Middle East, the analogy I came up with is IKEA. Because you ever been to IKEA?
Oh yeah.
IKEA works really great in Sweden because people in Sweden will wait in line. So they will walk the path and they'll look at the furniture, and it'll all work exactly as it's supposed to. So you follow the path, you don't go off it, you look at the furniture, you get your meatballs, you're on your way, right?
Hmm.
In America, of course, it's total bedlam. Nobody stays on the path. Everybody's walking all over the place. And that is what exporting American democracy to a country like Iraq or Iran is like. And to be frank, I think based on what we have here, I don't necessarily think American democracy is anything we want to be exporting anymore. I think we ought to kind of fix ours first. Now, what's interesting here, though, is the polling's super inconclusive. right?
Hmm.
So you've got the standard talking heads. So you've got Tucker Carlson fighting with Ted Cruz, and Trump insulting Tucker Carlson, and Marjorie Taylor Greene sticking up for Tucker Carlson, and it's everybody kind of fighting each other. It looks just like the Democrats, right? But the polling is just kind of all over the place. So there's one poll put out that says a majority of MAGA Republicans support U.S. strikes on Iran. There's a YouGov poll that says 53% of Trump's 2024 voters oppose U.S. involvement in an Iran Israel war. So it's kind of like, I don't even think the Republicans know what they want to do. And I think this makes it very difficult for Trump because he is very, very good at understanding what his base wants. And his base doesn't even know what his base wants right now.
And I think it has to do with this very conflicting message of the scare tactic of, yes, we have to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons. That'd be bad for the region. They may not be able to strike us, but they certainly could strike our allies in the surrounding area. It was the same type of thing that bolstered support for the Iraq invasion, was the whole weapons of mass destruction thing, right? We have to stop Saddam from getting weapons of mass destruction. We're seeing that now with, we have to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But at the same time, again, there's a lot of people who have it freshly in their minds what happened with Iraq and Afghanistan. Those two wars are still very much at the forefront of this conversation, and a reason why a lot of people are like, we don't want to do this again.
As well, they should be.
Yeah.
As well, they should be. Do you know, if we go through American history and all the military involvements that America's had abroad, we have a pretty crappy hit rate,
Yeah.
in terms of stuff that was worth our while. I want to move to the immigration debate because, you're talking about scare tactics motivating the base behind a particular policy. I feel this kind of fits that bill. Now, we talked about this last week, how one of the interesting things about Trump's immigration policy is it was actually targeting red states. That was correct last week. It is no longer correct. Trump has been flip-flopping on the issue as to whether his administration is going to be deporting people who work in the ag industry, which is an industry that is especially dependent on undocumented labor and especially vulnerable to Trump's immigration policy. The ag industry, of course, is the backbone of a lot of red states and could really undermine their local economies. And so he indicated that maybe he'd suspend deportations. Then no, we're going to keep doing it. Then I don't even know where they stand right now. But the bottom line is Trump is in this exact same situation again, where he has a reliable group of voters whose economic interests are best served by suspending his aggressive deportation policy. And then there's a sizable number of people in the base who want to see mass deportations. And they can't reach an agreement, and Trump can't lead.
The problem here is that Trump is heavily reliant on the people in his inner circle to tell him how things are and what's going on. And that helps shape his opinion on things. The problem is that the people in his inner circle and the people who have his ear at any given moment are always changing, which is why you're seeing these very inconsistent messaging on Iran, on immigration, on tariffs, right? He's putting in tariffs. He has to take them away because he realizes how much they're hurting his friends, right? The same thing with the immigration stuff, right? The mass deportations are hurting big ag.
Well, you had, I think, 3 Republican governors: Cox of Utah, Landry, Louisiana, Parson of Missouri, warned of economic disruption. Trump's own ag secretary warned Trump that farmers were suffering. And then you've got Charlie Kirk, who's saying no compromise, deport them all.
Yeah.
Stephen Miller, of course, demanding that ICE uses all available resources to hit a quota of 3,000 a day. I don't know how he got that.
The thing that people need to understand is that people like Stephen Miller have always existed in the Republican Party. They've never been at the forefront of the conversation within the party, but they've always existed within the conservative wings. There's always been Republicans who have called for mass deportations. There's always been Republicans who have claimed that an invasion is happening in the United States, using these words. It's always existed within the Republican Party. However, elected officials up to this point have acknowledged that they're just unrealistic when you look at how much damage mass deporting illegal immigration would have on the economy alone, not to mention, all the other side effects, all the other side consequences of doing that, including how expensive it is for the government to do this.
Well, here's a little history too, because I happen to have done some extensive reading on the subject. So
Mm,
the presence of primarily Mexican laborers in the United States has pretty much been consistent since the founding of the Republic.
yeah,
So Mexicans crossing into the United States to work in farms, work in construction freely across the border was never really a problem. The only time they ever did mass deportations was in the Great Depression, when there were legitimately less jobs to go around. The Customs and Border Protection, right? Do you know why that was originally founded?
no, I don't.
It was founded to prevent Chinese immigrants from coming into America. So back in the 1860s or so, they passed a law prohibiting people coming over here from China. So people from China would come through Mexico and try and cross the border. They established the Customs and Border Protection to stop Chinese people from crossing into the country.
Mm,
So Mexicans were allowed to roam freely, right? And it didn't really start to become a problem until the 70s and 80s. I don't know exactly the reason why. Part of it could have been the drug war and the fact that drugs were coming up over the border. But the bottom line is that the U.S. economy has almost had a symbiotic relationship with cheap labor coming up from the southern border. And so
yeah.
what we're seeing now is an economic unknown for the United States. We've never not had undocumented workers doing
Mm,
jobs a lot of Americans didn't want to do. So I think they're ignoring reality. And part two, and I think this is something I've said on this podcast before, is when Trump started campaigning about people crossing the southern border back in 2015, border crossings were at their lowest point in history. So they didn't start rising until his administration. And then, of course, they got worse under Biden. But the bottom line is it's a case of a broken clock being right twice a day. It's bad now, but it wasn't bad when he first started talking about it.
the interesting thing about Trump is that during the 2024 campaign, a lot of the things he campaigned on were problems that arose in like 2021 and 2022. The border agency reported the most sightings of migrants crossing the southern border that in fiscal year 2021 than any other year that sort of data was recorded. And so that became part of the narrative. You started seeing all these stories about the conflict between, uh, you know, Greg Abbott in Texas and Joe Biden over securing the Texas border. And you start seeing all these stories about the influx of fentanyl. And then, so Trump is still campaigning off of an issue that arose in 2021, 2022, but since then had kind of simmered down a bit. And it's the same with, say, like inflation, right? Inflation rose exponentially in 2021 and 2022, but then started to decline by the time that of the 2024 election. But he was still campaigning off of those things.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing, what I always used as a barometer for how bad things were on the southern border was how the border counties voted.
Hmm.
So you can find data on how specific counties voted in specific states. And during I should say, all of Trump's first administration, the majority of border counties voted Democrat. So
Hmm.
that would tell you that the message Trump was delivering wasn't resonating. The people who are actually living on the border did not see what Trump said was going on. That's changed. So now you see a large number of border counties voting Republican. So it's clear it has become a problem. But
Hmm.
again, it's also from a flawed messenger. I think the through line between what we're seeing with Iran and what we're seeing uh, in the immigration debate is that the most successful tactic in elections for some time has been this sort of divisive form of ideological extremism. Trump used it to differentiate himself from his opponents in the 2015 or 2016 GOP primary. We've seen a lot of people follow his lead. Marjorie Taylor Greene is probably the most notable one, where they've used very divisive, incendiary language, extreme positions to gain an edge in the base. But then once they get into office, they can't do anything,
Yeah.
you know? And we're now at a point where there are two important decisions to make. Do you deport all the undocumented immigrants that the agricultural sector depends on? And do you declare war on Iran? Like, those are binary. You have to do one or the other.
Yeah, most lawmakers understand that during the campaign, you speak to the base because you have to. Because as we've talked about on this podcast, the primary election system that we have in this US dictates that you talk to the partisan base, the more ideological extreme voters, because those are the ones who consistently turn out in primary elections. And those are the ones that you have to worry about getting elected. But when they get into office, they understand that a lot of the promises and things that they talked about, the campaign trail, aren't possible. And that's the difference between campaigning and governing. What Trump has failed to do is make a distinction between campaigning and governing. Even his speeches as he is president sound more like campaign speeches, which is why we saw all this focus in the beginning of his second term on things that voters didn't even care about.
And, you know, something, I was actually talking to my mom about this, and I said, you can't make somebody angry, but you can give words to their anger.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that people are angry for very legitimate reasons now.
Yeah.
You know, they talk about grievance politics, and to an extent, I think the term's correct, but it also kind of glosses over why the grievance exists in the first place. And if you look at the places most susceptible, these are the places where people are under the most economic distress. They feel the most insecurity. And in a way, Trump has been able to take a segment of that population and give words to their anger and
Yeah.
give words to their fear. And I think the issue is that our current system makes it way too easy to mobilize that.
Yeah.
Because again, the system is such that your electoral advantage is based on your ability to mobilize people. And the
Yeah.
best way to mobilize people is to give a target to their fear and insecurity and then say you're going to fix it. And that's what's happening. And to your point, it doesn't make good government. Oddly enough, it's not necessarily what people want.
The danger here, though, is that when you have a strategy where you're constantly campaigning to grievance politics and mobilizing the grassroots movements that are going to get you elected, you have to constantly keep people angry. You have to
Mm-hmm.
constantly give them something to fear, which moves them further to the extremes and creates even more divisiveness within our politics. Trump has now no choice but to get his base riled up that what's happening on immigration is due to poor democratic leadership in states like California, right? So he's mobilizing troops to go to LA, which is just angering more people because now the left is angry at it, right? And so all you have is this perpetual cycle of anger and fear when your only focus is mobilizing the grassroots support you need to make it through primary elections that can get you a general election win.
Yeah. So I think, as always, we ought to let folks know that this is not inevitable and we don't just have to ride this car over the cliff. So
Mhm.
the primary system combined with our system of elections is the reason why fear and anger are such effective electoral tools. And what we've seen in states that use alternate systems is that this has been much less effective. So again, you and I have talked a lot about California, which is an open, nonpartisan primary state. What we've seen is that of the Republicans in California, the MAGA movement has had a very, very difficult time gaining traction. If we go to a redder state, Alaska, same exact thing, right? MAGA candidates have a very difficult time winning elections in Alaska because they have open, nonpartisan primaries where you're not just running to be the favorite Republican amongst Republicans. You actually have to be the favorite amongst all voters there. But both the system in Alaska and the system in California have shown us how just a minor change in the way you run elections that can be done at the state level, we don't have to wait for Washington for this, can result in more effective leadership. And I think that's the takeaway.
Yeah, in fact, you see more effective leadership when you do take a bottom-up approach to type of election reforms that could lead to more accountability, greater competition, more choice in elections, more power for the individual voter to actually have a meaningful say. And so when you take that bottom-up approach, you get more leadership in positions where it can affect change on a national level.
Yeah. So if you do want to learn more, I'm going to include a couple links in the show notes for you to take a look at. Check them out, get involved. Like I said, these are reforms that can take place at the state level, and it's way easier to make changes there than it is at the federal. So this is action you can take today. And we are going to cap it off there. Thank you very much for listening. If you like this episode, again, be sure to rate it, be sure to write a review, and share this with anyone you think might like it too. Subscribe if you have not already. The music you are listening to is courtesy of the U.S. Coast Guard Band. Thank you for listening to Middleweight Politics, and stay purple.